Yes, thank you.
Yes, as you, before Secretary General opens, you have heard that the recording has started now, so just to make sure everybody's aware of that. So please, Wojciech.
Okay, thank you very much. Excellencies, or dear members, dear participants, it is my real pleasure to welcome you to this series of webinars organized by the Committee on Equality and Non-Discrimination of the Parliamentary Assembly. And the first such a webinar focused on violence against women and COVID-19, and the second on challenges to sexual and reproductive health and rights in the time of the pandemic. So now the third one, we have the opportunity today to discuss the gender dimension of foreign policy in the response to the pandemic. And I very much hope that your discussions, exchanges of views, will provide valuable contribution to the preparation of the report underway in the Committee on Equality and Non-Discrimination. And I'm sure that our rapporteur, who is with us, Madam Petra Stienen, will find today's discussion beneficial to her work. And I would like to thank her wholeheartedly and to the President of the Committee, Madam Petra Bayer, who is also with us, for their initiative to organize this webinar and for inviting such eminent experts to share their views. And thank you very much indeed for that. During these difficult times, as you know, the Assembly has remained a place of dialogue, adapting its working procedures, intensifying also activities on social media. Our members continue to discuss, meet virtually, exchange on promoting our fundamental values, launching new and innovative ideas and subjects that reflect developments and realities in our member states. And the pandemic we are confronted with has given a sense of urgency for more inclusion, equality, and diversity at national and international levels. And we look very much forward to hearing on how foreign policies have taken this into account or could be doing so. And before I conclude, I would like to say that gender dimension of foreign policy is much more than gender equality in foreign policies. It is about incorporating gender perspective into foreign policy in its different aspects, including women's rights, including participation. But still, equality is a part of it. And in this context, before joining your webinar, I made a small research on women in diplomacy. And I think it's interesting also to look at that. We all know quite well different photos of diplomatic gatherings full of men in their black suits with no women at all or very few women present. Interesting to know how it has started. The first women in diplomacy. And there are three names which I would like to mention. It looks like that the first one was Madame Rosika Schwimmer from Hungary, who for a relatively short time in 1918 and 1919 was appointed ambassador to Switzerland. Then we have Madame Diana Abgar from Armenia, who in 1920, also for a relatively short time, was appointed consul in Japan. And then Alexandra Kołłątaj from the Soviet Union, who had her career as ambassador to Norway in 1924 and then subsequently in Sweden. And this is the very beginning, right, in diplomacy. At the level of foreign ministers, we have, as in the first one, as late as in 1947. This was Madame Anna Pauker from Romania, who served as foreign minister from 47 to 53. And the next one in this list is Golda Meir from Israel, as foreign minister from 56 to 64, as late as middle of 20th century. And I also looked, in a way, a little bit pro domo sua, the Council of Europe, our institution. We have 47 member states, and we have 47 representatives of our member states among us, 47 ambassadors. 9 of them are women, only 9 from among 47. I would say long way to go. I would like to wish all of you a very fruitful webinar, and I am looking forward to your discussions. Thank you very much. Maria, over to you.
Thank you, Wojciech, and thank you also for bringing this history into the picture, because it's true, we have come some way forward, but as you just mentioned about the Council of Europe and Committee of Ministers, we still have quite a long way to go. So I'm Maria Ruotanen, and I will be moderating this 1-hour session. And also warm welcome on my behalf, not only to the panelists, but also all those who are listening to us. And I'm very, very pleased that indeed Petra Stienen had this idea, not only of the webinar, but of the topic, because it's an important topic, I think, today to discuss, and also the chair of the Committee on Equality and Non-Discrimination, Petra Bayer, who is listening to us, because I think topics that this committee is tackling are indeed very topical and sometimes quite often actually ahead of the curve. So I'm very, very happy that we are discussing this. And I'm of course pleased to have the panel that we have, because you have a lot of know-how, and I think this way, by sharing experience, we'll be able to maybe trigger this feminist foreign policy or gender dimension foreign policy much further than it is today. So I will put questions to you panelists one by one, and then we will hopefully have time in the end to look what are the takeaways that you each have from this discussion and have some interaction. So the first one is Petra Stienen, who indeed is a rapporteur on gender dimension of foreign policy, and she's also, of course, member of the Assembly Committee on Gender Equality and Anti-Discrimination. So, Petra, you are preparing this report. Could you tell us how the COVID-19 crisis shows that including a gender dimension to foreign policy is actually very important?
Yes, thank you, Maria, and I'm so honored to be among this amazing group of speakers. I see some good friends and some people I met when we went on a fact-finding mission to Stockholm. I'm so happy to see Samira, Rafaela. I'm not going to mention all of them, but very happy to be among you. Well, 2020, Maria, was supposed to be the year of activism. We were supposed to celebrate 25 years of Beijing. Seriously, 1995, who doesn't remember? This was the year when Hillary Clinton said, women's rights are human rights. 2020 was also the year when we were supposed to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which really set a framework for women, peace and security. And then Corona knocked at our door, and we had all to go in lockdown. No more meetings in New York, no more gatherings, no more conspiring for the good cause. And I think before I go into the topic of today, I would like to point out a few things that I think are important for our discussion. One is that the coronavirus, or maybe COVID-19, is very much like a magnifying glass of inequalities in our society. We can see that certain groups have disproportionately been affected by this pandemic. Women of different ages, of different socioeconomic backgrounds, persons with disabilities, young people, people with different ethnic and racial backgrounds, elderly. If we add all of these groups, it's maybe 80% of the population. But as the Secretary General already mentioned, it's clearly a different group from the people who are taking the decisions. I think we can all agree that the crisis management of this crisis has a male face. And in many countries, it has the face of a white, middle-aged man. And I love them, but they're not representative of all of us. Because when I looked at these homogeneous teams, I was really wondering, where are the women? Where are the people of color? Where are the young people? And therefore, I think it would be really necessary to evaluate from a gender and inclusive perspective to what extent, and I'm going to be precise here, the interests, voices, and concerns of different groups were actually represented in the crisis groups, emergency measures, and the parliamentary debates throughout the 47 member states of the Council of Europe. I also want to be careful because I've seen a lot of cliches floating around. You know, on the one hand, women as the saving angels at our bedside, as nurses, as doctors, as teachers, as homeschooling moms. On the other side, women being the victims of the increase of domestic violence. And as much as that is all true, I think this is too much of a simplistic dichotomy. And on the other hand, more men have died from COVID-19 than women. And there are a lot of men who have been working on the front line as well, on the front line in professions that keep our societies going. I think in our assessment of how this COVID crisis has been handled, we should look into the devastating effects of what I call machismo politics, or maybe even testosterone politics, because we've seen quite some leaders who felt that they shouldn't show their weakness in wearing masks, in protecting their societies, or even themselves from contracting the virus. And I think it's also very important to look at the online harassment of activists, of politicians, of opinion makers, very often female politicians and activists, who are calling for a gendered and inclusive approach, and there is a lot of harassment against them. So we did see a lot of inclusive leadership, and therefore I would like to acknowledge that the leadership of some of the female leaders, such as Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand and Angela Merkel, have been a remarkable example of inclusive leadership. I think they show us that in times of crisis, we need to see leaders who show direction, who give meaning to that direction, but also who show empathy. Now, as a rapporteur of the report, Gender Dimensions of Foreign Policy, I found a lot of inspiration in the work of Margaret Wallström. I'm sure that Anne Burns will say something about this as well, but when Margaret Wallström said in 2014, as long as 50% of the population has lesser access to education, to healthcare, to the labor market, to public and political arenas, we really have to work towards improving women's rights, because this will really help all of us. So a focus on gender equality in foreign policy and international relations is really called for, especially in times when we see a backlash against women's rights. I know we all know about the unholy alliance. I call them the strange bedfellows, the conservative Americans, the very extreme conservative Muslims, and some people in Rome as well, close to the Vatican. This was true before COVID-19 knocked at our door, and it will be true in the post-recovery phase as well. I'm going to conclude, Madam Chair. My report, Gender Dimensions of Foreign Policy, has 4 concrete recommendations that are connected to the COVID crisis, and I think they could be useful when we're dealing with any health crisis or any economic crisis, or even in a post-conflict situation. First, we should guarantee the participation and representation of women in all crisis response planning and decision making. Second, we should undertake gender impact assessments and ensure gender budgeting for all recovery measures and financial packages. Third, we should protect women and girls from gender-based violence. And fourth, we should hold public debates on the gender dimensions of the COVID-19 pandemic and promote an intersectional approach to recovery plans. Madam Chair, I am looking forward to the introductions of the other speakers, and I'm sure that all of us can benefit from the ideas in this webinar for the work of the PACE Equality and Non-Discrimination Committee, for this report, and also for the upcoming report on gender equality and non-discrimination and COVID-19. Before I give back the floor, I also would like to thank the Secretariat of the committee for the tremendous work they've been doing to organize this fantastic webinar. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Petra. And of course, I should underline that Petra Stienen is also the rapporteur of the Assembly on a report of that particular same committee on COVID. So she's very knowledgeable of the topic indeed. And thank you also for giving very clear ideas what the recommendations in your forthcoming foreign policy report will be. So we are very much looking forward to that. I now have pleasure giving the floor to our second panelist, Bert Koenders, who is a professor of peace, justice and security at the Leiden University. He is also a special envoy of the World Bank for Fragile States. He is member of the board of trustees of the International Crisis Group and also commissioner of the International Commission on Missing Persons. a lot of titles there, huh? So, Mr. Koenders, as a male champion of women's rights and gender equality, how do you think foreign policy could include both women and men so that it doesn't look like Petra said, only with the male face? And what can men do to promote women's rights and gender equality, including in the times of crisis like COVID-19? Your microphone, Mr. Koenders.
I think it should work now. Does it? Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you to you and to the Rapporteur, Petra, Stienen, of course, to the Secretary General for having the opportunity to be part of what I think is a very, very important debate this afternoon. I think foreign policy and COVID is a crucial issue for men and women alike. I think the Secretary General just said, if you go to the average, and I'm interpreting a bit the average security meeting or sessions these days, yeah, it's a bit male dominated, there's no doubt about it. And it has been historically the case in that field. The more it was around foreign and security policy, the less women you saw actually in that field operating. And I think still the progress that we have made on this is still very, very fragile. I think I'm deeply convinced we have to accelerate the debate and give it some content. I do see some progress. I'm myself teaching in diplomacy and foreign affairs. I've been a foreign minister, and I saw both in terms of the younger generation of diplomats, not slow, not strong enough, but higher positions, getting to female diplomats and ambassadors, an enormous amount of people who are actually working on women's rights at the universities, but it's by far not enough. And I think we have to analyze a bit why that is the case and how we could change that. My inspiration has a lot been by what was then my colleague Margaret Wallström. I think she made herself sometimes extremely unpopular in the Council of Foreign Ministers by always starting with the issue of feminist foreign policy. But I had a lot of admiration for her to put this forward in a very coherent, constructive and structural way. She would always come back to it and give it a meaning. And I would think that for men, and that is your question, like in other areas, men and women have in all areas to benefit from equal representation. I think for many of the arguments we know that simply leads to better outputs. My own inspiration has come from 1995 when I was at the Cairo conference. I think we had three things going together. One is the consciousness of the need to this equal representation, both in terms of people, but also in action and what comes out of that action. The second was the mindset. And thirdly was really constantly looking at the actions plans that were there. I think the three go together. We have made, I think, tremendous progress with Resolution 1325, our peacekeeping operations, the role of women. When I was leading a peace operation in Africa, we really made a difference there by female peacekeepers, by making sure that on all human rights violations and the investigations there, women's rights were coming as a priority. I think the whole movement that started the issue of sexual and reproductive rights changed completely the debate around demography, including early child marriage and so on and so forth. And it became a whole field of action in development policy, which I think started there, but didn't only lead to reasonable results, let me put it that way, but also to strong women who were advocating that. I can talk about a lot of women, not only in development, but also in foreign policy, except for Margaret, who I was inspired by, and we worked together on security. Samantha Power, Susan Rice, of course, the Chancellor of Germany, Merkel, Madeleine Albright, and lately I've worked in the bank for Kristalina Georgieva, who now is a woman leader in the IMF. And you see the difference, by the way. I don't believe necessarily that all women leaders are better than male leaders. I think we need equal representation and we need to see what the policies are. But when I see for the leadership of the IMF at the moment, when it comes to COVID, to fragility and the role of women, we have a major difference there. And I think that's absolutely crucial. If we are in a time of Black Lives Matter, then of course we can again learn from the new inspiration on the street, namely about the systemic nature of the underrepresentation. I think Petra mentioned, I think very right, that we also have had our backlashes. I had no idea in 1995 that when I was in negotiating in 2015 and 16, again around resolutions within Europe and in the wider world, that we had a major backlash of identity politics, of populist politics in certain religious circles, which made from Afghanistan to the US to Brazil to some other countries that progress volatile. And this is, in my view, I might be a progressive politician, but this is not a matter of left and right, I think. Women's rights are something that I think is much broader than that. But this identity politics and this new patriarchal thinking is definitely a risk we have to think through in order to make progress. And therefore, I won't be too long. I hope we will have a discussion. I think it's important to link constantly leadership, policy, and technocratically it's called resource allocation. What do you do actually with those policies? And we have so many good examples. And I mentioned already the appointments needed, ministers of defense, ministers of foreign affairs, senior diplomats, but it's definitely not the only thing. It's in the content of politics. I mentioned peacekeeping operations, but I think Petra mentioned that. The women's issues are not issues of women and children or only about health. It is about the cornerstone of foreign and security policy. And as we see that foreign policy has become much more intertwined with domestic policy, be it around migration, be it around precarious jobs, be it about it for schooling, then you see already in the COVID consequences right now, and this is where your topic is around as well, that both men and women, and I think men have a big role to play, especially since there is this change and volatility, and we need to fight for these common interests, that there are a few areas that I think around COVID should be really come to the fore. And I don't have to go long into it because they are mentioned. First of all, it's on the economy. I see in my work for the World Bank in fragile states, but also elsewhere, that of course women still have most of the precarious, short-term, zero-contract jobs more than men. So we see the first risk in the secondary effects of COVID already going more to women. The Commission of Global Development in Washington just yesterday came out with a second worrying sign, namely that because of the closures of schools, especially a lot of progress that was starting to be made about girls' education could be at risk. The same goes for early marriage. And of course on domestic violence. Let me say about domestic violence that this definitely is an issue which males have to address. They're sometimes victims, but often very, very often perpetrators. And I think there is, in my view, a complete underestimation of that issue. Maybe that has something to do with these crisis teams that Petra was talking about. But the figures are very clear, and I don't see a concerted plan with the medical and with the police to deal with this in a coherent and constructive manner. Let me close just by saying, yes, I think it is a crucial issue. From, let's say, development policy to hardcore security and defense policy. That so many issues of international and national policy are intertwined where we have the need to come to a program of action. Certainly, I think we don't have to be pessimistic. I think there is a change of mind all over the world, but it is fragile. And when you get success in something, you get a counter-reaction. And I think we see that counter-reaction in the world in many countries at the moment. A sort of a, the male's white male sense of losing power and influence. And that is something not to joke around. That is, I think, something, first of all, to take seriously, to understand, and therefore to fight. I think that's the triangle of what we have to do. And in that sense, I think men and women have to have a struggle together. And I think it's excellent that, the Council of Europe is trying to focus on this and giving it a little bit of meat to ensure that also in the work of foreign ministers, defense ministers, people who deal with international issues, this is taken very, very seriously and as a priority of politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Koenders, also for bringing in your experience as a minister and work at the World Bank, because I think you brought in the global issues, including the questions of access to education and so on and so forth, which are very, very pressing. You mentioned the domestic violence, and of course we at the Council of Europe are very equipped to support and guide in that aspect because of our Istanbul Convention, which is a catalogue of practices that are applicable, especially now in the time of crisis as well. So I think important indeed that Council of Europe looks at these issues, and intersectionality, as you mentioned, it is indeed something is getting much more obvious now with the crisis. So I will now introduce Anne Bernes, who is a Swedish ambassador for gender equality and coordinator of Feminist foreign policy. Welcome, Anne. Sweden was the first country to officially launch the feminist foreign policy, and this policy was a pioneering step taken by the first feminist government in the world. Can you tell us about some of the landmark achievements and also the challenges that you see, and also whether you think there has been an impact of the COVID-19 on feminist foreign politics?
Thank you so much, and let me begin by thanking the organizers for its really timely discussion, and I feel already that feel that we are on the track to something new together. So thank you. You've been referring a lot to my former foreign minister, so just let me say that her motto more or less was that courage and patience, that's what we have to invest in this in order to move this envelope and carry it forward. And change is possible, she showed, and we have also made a journey here ourselves, referring to numbers when it comes to women ambassadors. Our first was in 1956. And our first female UN ambassador, which was the world's first woman UN ambassador, was in 1958. And now we have 50-50, more or less, men and women ambassadors in our foreign service, and there are about 50 female UN ambassadors. So change is possible. So let's continue. When it comes to landmark achievements, I would like to look at both the internal and external aspects of what we've been doing since 2014. And I would say that internally we've seen a true culture shift in a rather conservative system, as all ministries for foreign affairs tend to be. And in a very short time. And from a stage where it was totally unexpected that our foreign minister was going to make that announcement, which she did her first day in office in 2014. And the result is that it's become everyone's issue. And it is a change from gender mainstreaming having been with us since the 1990s. It has become much more everyone's true issue, with a creativity and a shouldering of responsibility that leaves me in awe constantly, and leading to results across all our policy areas and the goals that we've put. When it comes to the external landmarks, I would say that I agree with previous speakers that this is beginning to become a new normal. And that is what we have been aiming for, where gender equality is not seen and treated as a women's issue, but as an issue of peace, security, and sustainable development, hence a key foreign policy issue. So something of a culture shift also internationally, not least proved by the fact that we're no longer alone in pursuing a feminist foreign policy. We have France with us here. We have, you talk about the feminist diplomacy, you will come back to that, Defin. We have Canada, Luxembourg, Mexico, Spain, and only yesterday we heard about yet another country in another region talking about the establishment of a feminist diplomacy, I think they will choose to call it. But the feminist foreign policy has not only made its mark internally and at country level, but also globally, I would say, and importantly for us at grassroots level. So it's not just talk, but it's something that actually is noticed and treasured, I would say, among those who we want to help. As an example, I would like to quote an Ethiopian civil society representative that I've happened to be in contact with this week, actually. And here's what she says. I think the Swedish feminist foreign policy has been such a novelty by putting feminist and foreign policy in the same sentence. And by doing that, has played a key role in ensuring that the word feminism is no longer a bad word. Not just that, you now see heads of government and UN agencies, men and women alike, using the same line. That is a great victory in truly ushering that the personal is political and concepts like intersectionality into a global agenda. So I think that's not us talking. So I just wanted to add that. When it comes to key challenges, I would also like to look at that from different angles. Internally, mainstreaming can result in everyone's issue becoming no one's issue. And the fact that everyone gets a start kit or a toolkit or whatever you want to call it will not mean that everyone is fine and doing it by themselves. The more people you have doing something, the more questions and issues will come up, and at a more complicated or sort of qualitatively advanced level. So at the beginning, we were too few in the coordination hub. It was one person. Now we're 3, so we're coping, but only together with a network of focal points in all the embassies, at least one in every embassy and at least one in every department here in Stockholm. And also thanks to the fact that we're not only a feminist foreign policy country, we also have a feminist government, which has been mentioned. So we have this constant dialogue and support of going to and fro from us to the Ministry for Employment, where the hub for the government offices gender mainstreaming sits. So that has been key for us, and there are then people in all the ministries working for this, and we have, the Ministry for Treasury, for Finance, working with gender budgeting in the state budget and all that and that is really important. In order to make an impact, you have to try to walk the talk and try to develop yourself. Externally, a key challenge is always, I think we've all met that, how to reach and convince those who do not agree. And what we have learned there is that you need data, you need concrete examples, and here I come back to the examples from our own society and the fact that we are also still working on this. That we show that and we dialogue around that is really important if you want to change anyone else. So it often comes down to customized, tailor-made approaches in order to try to convince someone who's sort of far away from being there. So it's very time-consuming, but if you choose a strategic enough person or group and win them over, that can multiply in a lot of impact. So that's what we try to do. We try to single out who are the movers and shakers here, and then we go for them. And such epiphanies or ahas bring me over to COVID-19 and what it has meant to all our work. And I think that it's been rightly put that this really is a magnifying glass for all the structural inequalities that you can possibly think, added with some new challenges. So it is, the super year has really become the most challenging year ever for gender equality, I would say, in modern times. And once again, in crisis, conflict, whatever happens, that is turn people's attention away. This perspective tends to be left out and forgotten again. So the rights and gender perspective often gets out. And there we have been helped by the feminist foreign policy, which has worked as a reflex and a reminder for us to still remember it. So we have been early in raising these issues, and then have done that consistently at all levels, and now work in all the ways that we can, from our development cooperation, readjusting that to dialogue, lobbying, advocacy, you name it. So it's been had a huge impact on the way we work, but I think that the fact that we have core funding that is applicable fast, and that people really know how to adjust and use this perspective has helped us a lot. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really useful and interesting to hear how you have actually been able to mainstream the gender at the different levels, and what are the structures that you have in place to do that even during the crisis. So I think this is something that has certainly helped you tremendously. I will now give floor to Samira Rafaela, who is a member of the European Parliament and coordinator of Renew Europe for the FEM committee at the European Parliament. Ms. Rafaela, the COVID-19 crisis, as we already heard, has really impacted disproportionately women, also minorities and persons that are already vulnerable for different reasons. How are you at the European Parliament and you personally working to ensure a gendered, inclusive and intersectional response to the COVID crisis?
Yes, thank you very much. So first of all, thank you to the organizers and also Petra Stienen, who is very well known in the Netherlands, but also in Europe and in the world for her work on women's rights. Let me first start with what we did recently, actually, in the European Parliament. We organized a webinar on specifically the impact of COVID-19 on the situation of women in Europe. We have also spoken with, for example, UN Women, and in general, we could conclude that there is this major challenge when it comes to data and statistics that can tell us specifically how women are being targeted in the corona crisis. So that is, first of all, I think, a very important conclusion that we can make, and that we also need to work on in the European Parliament. We need to work with the EU institutions and the experts that can give us and help us gathering the data and the statistics, so that we can really build upon concrete measures to protect and help women in this specific situation. When it comes to women in foreign policy, there's a previous research being done by the Parliamentary Research Service, and it was called this topic was called The Contours of a Timely Debate. And I remembered reading this briefly, and it stated that there was a growing body of evidence regarding the positive effect of including women in areas of foreign and security policy. So we have the evidence, we have the proof, but I think still it's a bit, to be honest, a little bit ridiculous that we need evidence to say that there will be a positive effect when women are being included. But okay, the evidence is there. And based on the numbers, we have had underrepresentation of women in many key EU positions. So, for example, based on last figures, only 6 women in the EU hold or held the position of defense ministers. That was in 2019. But the good thing is, for example, that in the Netherlands, we are contributing in a positive way. But 3 out of 27 foreign ministers in the EU are women, so only 3 out of the 27. And the current representation of female parliamentarians in the parliament itself is 40.4%. Well, we're going in the right direction. But if we look specifically to the 5 committees and the subcommittees that deal with the external affairs, we see a drop in the number to 35.2%. So even though we have progress when it comes to the representation of women in the European Parliament, we do see that they do not participate enough in the committees that are working on the external affairs and foreign affairs. And I think it sounds very logical when I argument that we need women there in the decision-making process, and in particular in these topics that really touch upon security and foreign affairs, because it also brings a lot of risks when women are not involved in this kind of topics, but also in the decision-making process. So when it comes specifically to the role of the European Parliament, it is a very urgent debate, and I myself as a FEM coordinator will also work on new priorities based on the outcome of the webinar that we had. So data, that's very important, statistics, very important. And we also debated and decided about a resolution in April, specifically on the COVID-19 situation. And in that resolution, we have asked for a gender analysis. So you can compare that to a gender impact assessment, where we have called upon the European Commission to do that quickly, so that we exactly know what is going on. I'm also the shadow rapporteur for the FEM Committee on the Gender Equality in EU's Foreign and Security Policy. And in this motion for the resolution that we also already decided upon, we called for gender mainstreaming in all EU policies, because we see that that needs to be part of the solution. So if you really want to make sure that we come to these good solutions, and especially in the COVID-19 crisis, I already said as FEM coordinator for Renew that I'm going to work with the other committees, because we need to also guarantee the intersectionality in this. So we also drew attention to the absence of the gender response budgeting in the resolution that was about gender equality in EU's foreign and security policy. We also paid attention to a lack of commitment on the part of the EU leaders, and the lack of institutional architecture and incentives to motivate and adequately support staff. And we also recognize that policy coherence in the area of gender equality is also lacking, and there's a lack of a unified system in understanding and the implementation of gender mainstreaming in EU institutions. So we basically said that we really need to work on this gender mainstreaming in and outside the EU institutions, because it starts also in the EU institutions. If we start there, then we are sure that we ask the right questions and we decide about the right things. So therefore, we also need more women, of course, represented in all the decision-making levels. I think also that we definitely need more countries with a feminist foreign policy. And that also means, I totally agree with Mr. Koenders, that also men should be involved in that dialogue. And that also means that male leaders should take responsibility to lead in this, because we have definitely still a challenge now in the EU, in Europe, in the member states to address all these inequalities. And when we are discussing gender dimensions in our activities and policies, we really need to ensure that we leave no one behind. And moreover, I would definitely stress that we should take this intersectionality also into account. I am very glad that that's becoming part of the discussion, so that we also focus on different groups of women with diverse backgrounds, with different backgrounds, because I also see that if we want to target women in a positive way, and especially when it comes to the solutions for the COVID-19 crisis, that we need to take into account that women with a migrant background, women of color, women with disabilities are being targeted in another way. So that is just to give you a summary on what we are going to do and what we already did in the European Parliament. So we will strongly monitor, of course, if the resolution on gender equality in the foreign and security policy is being implemented, but we also will monitor how quickly the European Commission will work on the gender analysis, specifically in relation to the COVID-19. And what is also important for us to take into account, of course, that a lot of women, and Petra already mentioned it, of course, that women are working in the front line. We also saw that there was this spike, a rise of women being a victim of domestic violence. And based on the webinar that we had, we also said as a FEM committee, well, at least the Renew group for the FEM committee, but that is something that I will definitely bring up on group level in the European Parliament, is that we should work on a plan against domestic violence, specifically in how we are going to protect women during this crisis. We have recently, well, there was a couple of weeks ago already, we have wrote a letter to the European Commission to call upon the member states to exchange best practices, to invest in the solutions that can protect women that are experiencing now violence behind the door. And I'm glad to see that there are member states now introducing, for example, the code word, that women can go, for example, to local places to ask for help. But that's definitely not enough. And let's also be very fair. There are still 6 member states who did not ratify the Istanbul Convention. So if we really want the longer term solution, then one of the main priorities right now is to make sure that the Istanbul Convention will be ratified and will work for women. So finally, but yet importantly, I think we should definitely discuss how in the future we can have more women that are defense ministers, foreign affairs ministers. We need more male leaders also to take up this topic. And main priority is data and the protection of women against domestic violence in this corona crisis. Yes, so thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting to hear, also sitting here in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, because these issues that you raised are also very, very relevant to our work, and I'm sure many things are, many points will be taken on board by the report of Petra Stienen in the 2 reports that she's actually preparing. So thank you very much for this input, and also for your supportive words for the Istanbul Convention. I now have pleasure to introduce Delphine O, who is Secretary General of the Generation Equality Forum 2020-2021 from the Ministry for Foreign and European Affairs of France. France has now launched an ambitious feminist diplomacy and is also a strong supporter and promoter of feminist policy and feminist diplomacy at international level. And in this context, France was one of the 2 host countries for the most important global gathering of this year, the celebrational year, as Petra Stienen mentioned, and that is namely the Generation Equality Forum. And of course, this COVID and the health crisis, it has impacts on gender equality, women's human rights, but also on the organization of this very forum. And I would like to ask you, Delphine, what is France doing to have the momentum going, and also to make sure that the objectives and the contributions that all the relevant stakeholders have made are not negatively impacted by this crisis?
Thank you very much to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe for setting up this important virtual conversation. Hello to everybody, and especially to Anne, my fellow ambassador for gender equality and fellow standard bearer of feminist diplomacy in this diplomatic community. I would like first to say a few words about French feminist diplomacy modeled after the Swedish feminist diplomacy, and then I will go on to explain how we are sort of remodeling and reshaping the Generation Equality Forum, which has been postponed to next year because of the COVID crisis. So France adopted last year in 2019 its feminist diplomacy after Sweden and Canada. And it has been really at the core and at the forefront of our foreign policy ever since President Emmanuel Macron was elected in 2017. One of the ways that our feminist diplomacy is being implemented is that anytime that France is being the chair or the president of any kind of multilateral organizations or any kind of multilateral circle, then it is really trying to center the gender dimension at the center of its activities. I will just give you one example. Last year, France was was holding the presidency of the G7, and it was very important for President Macron to make sure that there was what we call a G7 equality, so multiple gatherings of equality ministers of the G7 countries. And there was a very important decision that was made by the G7 presidency. Namely, the Biarritz Partnership was launched, which is this coalition of G7 countries, but also going beyond 10 or 15 countries that have made national commitments towards gender equality based on a guidebook of best practices that have been gathered by different countries. We had also centered feminist diplomacy and gender equality for our G7 presidency by helping and supporting the launch of the International Fund for Survivors of Sexual Violence in conflict-affected areas, which is being heralded by Dr. Denis Mukwege, who is a Nobel Peace Prize winner, together with Nadia Murad, who's also the Nobel Peace Prize winner. And by the way, the two of them were co-chairing the Gender Equality Advisory Council to the President, directly to the President during the G7. Similarly, France will really center gender equality in its foreign policy by putting it at the fore of its presidency of the United Nations Security Council, putting it at the center and at the fore of its application to become a chair state for the United Nations Human Rights Council, and so on and so on. So anytime we have the opportunity as one of the major countries leading in the international community, we do make sure that the gender dimension is there really much at the forefront. I wanted to also take the opportunity to say that France is a very, very strong promoter of the Istanbul Convention of the Council of Europe, especially our Secretary of State for Gender Equality, Marlène Schiappa, who takes any opportunity to talk about the Istanbul Convention, and we really have embarked on a very large and wide diplomatic campaign to promote the convention and to persuade other member states who may not have adopted yet to adopt it. So it's very important for us. We consider it the most advanced international vehicle in order to prevent and combat sexual and gender-based violence. Now on to the Generation Equality Forum. The Generation Equality Forum, which is the new name of the Beijing Plus 25 Forum, is and remains the largest and most important international summit for gender equality and women's rights of the past 25 years. The Beijing Conference and the Beijing Declaration happened 25 years ago in 1995 in China. Since then, we haven't had a gathering of that importance and of that size in order to gather activists, member states, international organizations, private sector, philanthropies, youth-led organizations, civil society organizations in one single place, actually in two places, because it will take place in Mexico first and in Paris then. Unfortunately, the forum was scheduled to take place in Paris in July, in less than 1 month, early July. Due to the obvious sanitary crisis, we have been compelled to postpone it to next year, and it will take place in the first half of 2021. Now, the fact that the Generation Equality has been postponed actually does not take away anything from the momentum for gender equality, as has been said before me. It actually even adds to the relevance and to the urgency of organizing such kind of international summits with different stakeholders, not only the member states and the international organizations, such as the Council of Europe, but also the private sector, also the youth organizations or stakeholders that were not present 25 years ago and not really part and parcel of the work towards gender equality. So next year, the forum will be basically two things. It will be the rallying place for all stakeholders invested in gender equality to take stock of what everyone has done during the COVID crisis to protect women's rights and to promote gender equality. So it's really 1 year basically after the crisis, because it would take place 1 year from now. It will be the time and the place for everybody to gather together in one place in Mexico and then in Paris and really take stock of what has been done during the crisis. What has been done during the past 25 years, of course, but also most specifically during the crisis. it will be also, and that's my second point, sort of a resource for innovative solutions. We want to see it in a positive light. We know that the COVID crisis has aggravated gender inequalities, has aggravated gender-based violence and domestic violence, has aggravated inequalities between men and women in many different areas. But we want the forum to be a gathering place for all stakeholders that have come up with new solutions, new mechanisms, new initiatives during the crisis, which is both a time for, I would say, grief, but also for opportunities. And so we want to see the forum in this positive light as a resource for all the member states, but also the other organizations and stakeholders to come together to see what has been done and put in place during the crisis. And those sort of best practices can be used in the future when and if, but probably there will be a new crisis and new lockdown measures specifically. Now, the centerpiece of the Generation Equality Forum is the Action Coalition. We have announced in January of this year 6 action coalitions, namely 6 areas of priorities that our work will focus on and which will gather the most energies, but also the most financing and the most mobilization from different member states. Those are very innovative mechanisms because they bring together at the same level of governance, not only the member states and the international organizations, but also the civil society organizations, the private sector, and the philanthropic foundations. So it's really a way to bring together, and also the parliament. It's also it's really an innovative way to bring together different stakeholders, put them together, sort of the board of the action coalition. And these action coalitions will be entirely focused on concrete actions with very concrete announcements of funding to be made in Mexico and in Paris, with a schedule for the next 5 years. So we had originally scheduled 2020 to 2025, but we probably go from 2021 to 2026 with concrete objectives to be reached in 2026 with accountability mechanisms. The 6 action coalitions, one of them is on gender-based violence, another one on economic empowerment, another one on women and climate, and so on. They're all the more relevant now because of the crisis. They haven't lost any relevance during the crisis, but for sure we will also focus on emerging themes and issues such as the place and the role of women in the global governance, especially in the global governance of health, because we've been talking a lot about global governance of health in the past weeks and months. Also on economic inequalities, the crisis has shown that women are the majority of frontline workers in the COVID crisis, in the healthcare sector, but also cashiers, teachers, and so on. They have actually been fighting the fight on the front lines against COVID. So again, the Generation Equality Forum, that will be sort of the place to be next year in 2021 to take stock of everything that has happened in the past 25 years, but more specifically during the crisis, and to launch a new momentum and a new dynamic for the next 5 to 10 years with all the different stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think it was very interesting for us and reassuring to hear also that the plans will just be moved ahead a couple of months, and also how you will be using this occasion, this forum, also to take stock of how best tackle eventual next crisis. So I think this is very, very good news. And also thank you for underlining also the Istanbul Convention. We do know, of course, that your State Secretary Schiappa, but the whole government is very much supporting it. France actually had the presidency of the Council of Europe not so long ago, and they had violence against women as one of the priorities, so that's very, very important. Thank you for that. Now I have the pleasure to introduce the last speaker, who is Jennifer Cassidy, who is a lecturer at the Oxford University, and she's also editor of a book called Gender and Diplomacy, and also Jennifer is a former diplomat. Now, after all this discussion we have heard, do you think that gender has been duly taken into consideration in international response to COVID-19? And what are the key lessons learned? And what is the way forward, Jennifer?
Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak. And I think I'm in quite a unique position regarding this question, having myself, I think I can say some personal thing that I was hospitalized quite severely twice from COVID-19 not long ago. So I didn't think I'd be sitting here doing analysis on the gendered aspect of the international response, but I'm very glad and fortunate that I am. But I think regardless of my experience, my own personal experience with it, and having experienced it within the UK, and I think we can all say, regardless of whether this is Chatham House or not, the figures show for itself. The UK's response and the fatality rate that we have experienced here is quite shocking in itself. So that's something very much something to unpack and something we are experiencing every single day. So yes, as you said, the question: do you think that gender has been duly taken into consideration in the international response to COVID-19, and what are the key lessons learned? And what is the way forward? So, as I mentioned, we are still in the process of this. So, to give any kind of concrete overriding answer would be somewhat foolish of me. But to answer the first question, I can say yes and no. Perhaps not the exact answer people were looking for, but perhaps the one that people expected. But nonetheless, the inclusion of such an ambiguous answer, I think, is correct and representative of how I feel and how I view the international response, indeed how I view the foreign policy response as a whole, regardless of whether we're viewing the response to a pandemic or not. But the evidence shows us that the disease, this is pre-COVID, and we had response plans for pandemics before this, whether they were taken upon by nation states or not is very different and varies between nation states. But evidence had shown us that disease outbreaks affects women and men quite substantially in a very different manner, and that pandemics, as we've seen and heard today, they exacerbate inequalities for girls and women, who are often the hardest hit, and that women play an outside role responding to crises in a lot of nation states, including, as we've heard, frontline health and care and social workers, caregivers at home, mobilizers in their communities. And that's why the world must, in my opinion, put a gendered lens on the response to COVID-19, which I have not seen so much at a nation state level, a foreign policy level. We have outliers, of course, and we've heard them about here today, but as a whole, and certainly within the country I reside in, this is not, if anything, it has been, unfortunately, the worst response. And I say that, you can quote me on that. I'm quite strong at the moment in my response regarding that. But regarding this, we need to ensure, in this respect, the unique needs of women and girls are addressed, and that their unique expertise is leveraged. This includes, as we know, positioning women, girls and young women in all the diversity and in all settings, front and center in the emergency responses. And a phrase I always come back to that I heard Margaret Walsham speak many, many years ago when I first learned of a feminist foreign policy, and it's stuck with me all these years later, regarding when we are crafting and implementing policies which do directly affect women. And I'm not saying a feminist foreign policy, as we stated today, is purely about women. It is the overarching aim and the overarching view of how we look at society. But when we do look at, certainly when we look at policies which directly affect women and girls, her phrase was nothing about us without us. And I just think that's something that's stuck with me and is always etched in my brain. And I think it's a phenomenal, just so succinct when we are looking at policies. But I think what is unique about any pandemic is that there did say there was, of course, there was rule books and guidebooks, particularly in the US and the UK. I'm not sure of other nation states. I haven't been able to delve into it too much, but there were pandemic guidebooks on what to do. But particularly during a crisis and pandemic, we really saw that there was no time to overhaul the system. There was no time to change social norms and customary values. There was no time to alter institutions in their entirety. Indeed, there was barely enough time, particularly in the UK, to save lives. And so, and it has been noted already, what the pandemic really did do was highlight clearly those institutions and those nation states that had made such substantial progress in the realm of equality and equity in all spheres. And what it did to shine an even brighter light on those that had not. So the existing structures and the systems in place and those that had not been promised or had not promised or continued on the road of trying to instigate change pre the pandemic, this was very, very clear for all to see. So when we look at a gender blind response, or we ask ourselves the question, what is a gender blind response or a foreign policy, gender blind foreign policy response to the pandemic? It does bring us again to the question, well, who is making this foreign policy? Who is leading it? And I'm very glad to hear that we've been discussing even pre this point about that when we speak about a feminist foreign policy, or when I speak, I know the book is entitled Gender and Diplomacy, but I was young and naive back then, and I didn't feel I could say it to the publishers. It was my first book that I didn't want gender and diplomacy. I wanted the gender of, I did say it once and they said it wouldn't sell. So I didn't have enough confidence to keep pushing, but I know for again. But when I speak about gender and diplomacy, I really do, and Petra knows this from us speaking before, but I very much emphasize the gender of diplomacy. And by that, I mean not the gender and, not gender with. It means that we use gender, and we've all mentioned it here today in different forms and shapes, by using gender as a lens in which to study diplomacy and practice it and create policy. We do not take the participation of men in diplomacy for granted. Rather, using gender as a lens to study diplomacy, it allows us to see how normative ideas of masculinity and manhood have shaped how we view policy, have shaped how our institutions have been created. And with that, we can see how and why we view diplomacy and foreign policy in the way we do. So it is not just about men and women, as we've spoken today. It is the overarching framework. And that's why I speak about the gender of diplomacy. And particularly one aspect of the gender of diplomacy, which is very important here when we look at the numbers of women leading nations in this time of pandemic and foreign policy leaders and not just ambassadors, is that now in my research on, my speciality is as some may know, but it's actually technology and diplomacy, but I also research, of course, on gender and diplomacy. One of the avenues is to look at how many, not just how many women, but where are the women? And we have touched on this on defence, on aspect of defence, on aspect of healthcare. But the statistics show that we're currently at 16% of female ambassadors around the world, even less when we look at foreign ministers, even less when we look at heads of state. And when even we look at the numbers, and if we look at that 16%, we have to ask, well, where are those female ambassadors? And I myself work for the Irish Foreign Ministry, and this is always, I can say an amusing anecdote, but it's not that amusing, but it's funny enough. But when I was giving this research back to them, I said, well, you know, from 9,000 female ambassadors that from historically that we did an analysis on, it was clear that women were not getting New York, they were not getting Geneva, they were not getting Paris, they were not getting Brussels, they were not getting Washington, they weren't getting they weren't getting Brussels, somewhere, outliers, yes, but overall. And my response was to a colleague who I very much get on with, but he responded, oh, well, Jennifer, you know, we've had a female ambassador to New York, Paris, Brussels, Geneva, Washington. And I was like, yes, but it was the same woman. It was the same woman just rotating. And they were like, we forgot you worked for us. Well played. Good. And I was like, yeah, it doesn't count if it's the same woman who is phenomenal. She was my ambassador in New York, Ambassador Anne Anderson. But, you know, that's an outlier case, particularly in the Irish ministry. So it matters who is making the policy, because we're seeing today regarding COVID that the world leaders here, as I said, are mostly men, and these men tend to represent the elite and dominant social group, particularly look no further, as in the case where I am in the UK, where both our Prime Minister and our healthcare worker thought it was COVID was some way above them not wearing masks to meet COVID patients and then themselves contracting the. I'll say no more on that for fear of going on any kind of thing that is regarding it's publicized, but people know my views. I think I highlight them publicly enough. This is why I'm not a diplomat anymore. I think people can gather that by now. But for example, President Donald J. Trump recently announced the president's coronavirus task force of 12 men, 11 of whom are white. And the Global Health 50/50 report, there is a PDF, I'm happy to send it around if people don't, or people to point people to it, from 2019 even finds that 72% of executive heads in global health are men. So equity issues are only meaningful integrated into emergency responses when women and marginalized groups are able to participate in decision making. Now, I'm very much looking at the time. I could say a lot more, but I don't want to go over I actually had so much more written, but I'll just say 5 areas which I can hand around in a response to I won't go into the paragraphs under them, but moving forward is the first is to apply best practices and a gendered lens to all COVID related efforts. Second, which is very much my area of research and analysis, is leverage smart data to inform and shape policies and investments. The third is to engage women through partnerships, funding, and leadership positions, which we discussed. The fourth is protect, which was also discussed, protect women on the front lines of the COVID-19 response. And fifth is safeguard maternal, sexual, and reproductive health. Happy to send around them in paragraph form regarding the policies, but I will not take up any more of your time. So thank you very much for listening. I'm glad to be here today.
Thank you very much, and thank you all the panelists. I think you had a lot to say, but we could continue much longer, and I think we have to continue because this is clearly a topic that will stay with us for years to come. Thank you also underlining that how important is looking who is making the politics. And also when you look at the woman, it's not the numbers, but also where they are and what other positions that they are occupying. So that's a very important point. Now I'm also looking at the time, so we are running a little bit over, but I would like each one of you to give me one takeaway from this discussion. And I will start in the same order as before. So I will first ask Petra, please.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank to all of you. I think for summer reading, I have a recommendation, the book by Caroline Criado Perez, Invisible Women. I think most of you have referred to the importance of real data. She said in an interview recently, the plural of anecdotes is not data. And I think we've seen quite some interesting, this is my takeaway, that measures taken during COVID are never one size fits all. So we need diverse teams. For somebody to say, when you have a lockdown measure and you say, yes, people can be going out for 1 hour a day to do sports, only running and cycling, that this is actually excluding mothers who want to bring their stroller. And don't take me wrong, I'm not seeing women only in their role of mothers, but you can see that some of the measures are very exclusive to a small group. And I like the courage and patience, and I'm so happy that Bert Koenders has experienced Margaret Wallström's obnoxious courage and patience, because it's great to have him here as well. And I think we could learn more from all of us. So maybe we should have a live meeting somewhere in Strasbourg in September or October.
We will definitely do that. We will have a live meeting, I'm sure. So, Mr. Koenders, your takeaway.
Well, thank you very much for being part of this discussion. I really enjoyed it, and there are lots of ideas, but I think there's a lot of common thinking as well. Look, I think there are 3 things important which might be interesting to follow up, hearing all the colleagues there. Look, on the issue, which is maybe not the most interesting one, but it's the most crucial one in terms of making sure that things actually happen, is data, statistics, and info. Everybody mentioned that. Look, we live in a time that everything is measured. You go to the screens on TV on Corona, on COVID-19, where, when, how. There should be a possibility to do this gender-based pretty quickly. I would really recommend the Council of Europe to make sure that it actually happens. I'm in favor of a few things happening right now, actually, because before you know it, we will look in a year if it happens. But I think the possibility to influence this is now. And I think it's not particularly difficult. The second is I'm part now as a special envoy of the World Bank, working on a lot of the fragile states, so very much the most difficult places where the fragility is high. We are going to spend the $150 or $160 billion in the next year and a half or so. And we are not the only ones, but we are definitely the big ones. So is the IMF. I remember when I was a member of parliament, the Council of Europe the Parliamentary Assembly had a very close relationship with some of the UN and Bretton Woods institutions. And I would suggest very much that you get together with the parliamentary network on the World Bank and the IMF to ensure that this money is actually, as you call it, also gender budgeted. I wouldn't be overly negative about that. I was just looking at a report that we are doing, and it is much more than ticking a box. This has been, throughout the years, an asset of our work. This issue of gender and economic policy and jobs and fragility and precariousness is there. But listen, you are parliamentarians. I would say if the power of the budget in Europe and in the national parliaments and in the Council of Europe, use this. There's so much to be spent. Building back better is a possibility right now. So that would be my second suggestion, and maybe a takeaway as well. The third is on sexual violence and rape. We have some reports, I think they came out as well today, it was in Nigeria, some other places, where the whole issue of lockdowns and precarious living and rape is getting staggering in terms of figures. I would make sure that in some of these OMTs, these teams that are advising the government, I think some of you mentioned that, this is incorporated in the reporting of it. So that this is again not so much, facts by themselves and then say it's bad. These teams are working as we speak. And so I think they could help in also the reduction of this issue in many countries around the world, in Europe, by the way, including the member states of the Council of Europe. So these are the three ideas I have as takeaways from you. And thank you very much for organizing this.
Thank you, Mr. Koenders, also for giving these hints where the Council of Europe and the Parliamentary Assembly should really focus its next action. And indeed, the World Bank and IMF, we have had some cooperation and links with them, but not at the way that you mentioned there in terms of parliamentary scrutiny. So we certainly take that on board. So now I will ask Ms. Bernes for her takeaway.
Thank you so much. It's been such a rich discussion, so it's really hard to pick a few. But I would say that all we've said really pointed to the key importance of the gender dimension in foreign policy, as in every policy, I would say. As a goal and as a means for reaching any other goal. So that has just. It's great support to feel that we are many in this. I also agree totally that COVID-19 can, if we use it in the best possible way, be a turning point, an eye-opener for those who haven't, got it yet, and a lever for real change. These kinds of conditions that we are living now are hugely difficult, but at these times also politicians can make brave reforms if they see the opportunity and are farsighted enough, and we must help them to do that. We've talked a lot about getting more women in, and that is crucial. What Margaret Wallström said, nothing about them without them still stands, and very much so. But we also have to change the circumstances. It can't always be women's responsibility to do it and to make everything right. You know, we really have to work on the playing field and on the men. I would say it's everyone's responsibility. It's not a women's issue. It's everyone's issue, and we really have to become better at that. And when it comes to that, I would say that, you know, we've talked a lot about the importance of enhancing the protection against gender-based violence. We also have to increase the prevention. Oh yes, that's part of the protection, but the prevention, we have to work upstream, and also again with the men and the norms, which we also see in the harassment that you mentioned, Petra. And that brings me to the fifth point. SRHR has not been mentioned as much as GBV, but it is really the single issue where you see most of the polarization, which we also see now in lockdown, where these services are pushed out. And also what we see in Africa, for example, is that churches, evangelists are very active in the virtual realm and using that in order to reach more very religious constituencies. And we have to be there, and we really have to be there all the time. So thanks a lot for this.
Thank you very much. And I will now ask Ms. Rafaela, please.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm very sorry, but I need to excuse myself because I'm going into another webinar very, very soon. So I think a lot of things are being said, and I think 2 points are very important for me to take away. That is, the fundamental issue here is representation and the participation of women and women with a diverse background in all kinds of ways in our institutions, because then you get, you know, the right questions, then the right proposals are being made and put on the table, and I don't think we should underestimate that. So, but that's a very fundamental issue where EU institutions, but also political parties themselves can work on, because this is also, of course, a political discussion. And then the second thing is that we should definitely take into account, please do not forget, in the work that we do, in the work that you do, that women are different. So there's not one group of women. Women are facing different challenges because of who they are, where they come from, etc. So that's something that I constantly repeat. The intersectionality in our policies and proposals and legislation is extremely important, so we leave no one behind. So thank you very much. I really need to leave this webinar, but I really much appreciate this great discussion.
Thank you very much for having been with us. Very interesting input. I know that also Delphine O has to leave. I'm really sorry we went a little bit beyond the timing. So very quickly, what are your takeaways, please?
Yes, thank you very much. I also had another conference I'm supposed to be taking part, which started at 5, so very, very late. But anyway, one takeaway that I took away from this conversation is the importance of institutionalizing gender. Meaning then when I hear Anne, and it's not the first time that I hear her describing what a feminist diplomacy is today within the Swedish government, I'm struck by how it took years to arrive at this state of matter of fact, where by definition, by nature, really gender is at the center of everyone thinking, of every governmental organization, of every governmental agency, of every ministry, of any part of the state that is functioning. Gender is at the center. So when a crisis hits, such as this COVID crisis, the reflexes, so that it is instinctive that you think about gender. You don't have to think, oh, I have to put gender at the center. It's already there because it's inscribed and enshrined in the functioning of the system. And this is something that we also strive to achieve in France, because our feminist diplomacy is a bit younger than the Swedish feminist diplomacy. If you have the system in place that makes sure that whatever happens, whatever unusual happens that hits the system, everything is in place that will put gender at the center, then you don't need to waste time and lose time by fighting the system internally so that it integrates the gender dimension. And if everybody could be like Sweden today, and I hope France will be soon, it will be so much better when you have arrived at that state that you have 50% of women ambassadors, when you have gender mainstreaming in the entire state system, and also in private companies and in civil society and in foundations and so on, then it makes it much easier to you don't have to impose your views. Say it's naturally there. You don't have to go all the way to convince the decision makers that whenever they design a new policy, especially in an emergency situation, they do have to take into account gender. So that would definitely save us a lot of time if we could be able to institutionalize gender and mainstream it at all levels of representation and decision making. Thank you. And I would like to continue the work and a collaboration with PACE and with the Council of Europe for the Generation Equality Forum. So I hope to be in touch with all of you in the future.
Thank you very much for the important point, and we certainly will continue working together. Thank you very much, and good luck for your next webinar. And I also would like to ask Ms. Cassidy for her one takeaway, please.
Yes, thank you, and I'll be very brief. I'll just comment on the data as we have just drawn on it a little, and the representation. I'll be extremely succinct as I can be. But yes, drawing on what Mr. Koenders said as well, that I think going forward we should leverage smart data to inform and shape policies and investments. So the initial data indicates that I gather that more men and women, of course, as we know, are dying from COVID-19, and decision making and stakeholders need sex and age disaggregated data to further understand how this crisis is impacting and will continue to impact. This is not going to end simply once the lockdown has ended too, but how it's going to impact men and women differently. So this data, when we get the final group, it must be collected, analysed and used to inform all policies and investments, and must be available quickly and widely to analyse the impact of interventions and drive informed, timely decisions. And this information must include those who may often be excluded from the national data collection efforts, such as refugees, internally displaced people, migrant workers, and people with non-binary gendered identities. And my final point is just that on representation, and to echo the points of others, so I won't go on too much, but I very much agree that it is now time that the burden of representation, I say this a lot in my policy recommendations for gender and foreign ministries, but the burden of representation must now shift from that of the underrepresentation of women who have been fighting for reforms to the overrepresentation of men. So as we have heard already, that it should not always be women fighting to be let in and women fighting for change, but the overrepresentation of men, they must also come into this, and they have been, which is great to see and is always welcomed, but they should be also part of the reform. And finally, I will say regarding numerics, which ties into this of representation, that the 1 in 3 that is used by many ministries is simply not good enough, because one does not represent all women. Women come in, as we've noted before, we're not saying all women leaders are good. We're not saying all women diplomats are good, and that is just testament to the fact that we should not have a 1 in 3. We do not all speak the same, we do not all think the same. And finally, and I won't go into this, but I think class is a huge issue, particularly in the nation state that I'm currently in, and we saw it play a key role in the deaths, and particularly also in the US, people fearful of healthcare. But we saw the top level people getting tests, and I had to wait till I was in ICU to receive a test, despite being hospitalized twice. So I think class has a huge role to play in all aspects of foreign policy. But I will end it there.
Thank you very much, and thank you again all panelists on behalf of the Secretary General, Mr. Wojciech, Sawicki, and also the whole equality team that is with me listening to this. This has been really great, and I think there is a lot of reasons and material for us to continue working together. So thank you very much, and see you next time.
Thank you, Marja, for being a great chair. you.
Thank you very much all. Thank you.
Everybody.
Have
Thanks
a
so
lovely,
much.
have a lovely day. Bye bye.
Bye bye.